let's look at some ways that we can actually come up with reasonable, defensible weighted average cost of capital. And a couple of approaches that are commonly used are the subjective approach and the pure play approach. And these are techniques that managers use if they're looking at a particular project to say, hey, what is the appropriate cost of capital for that project? So with the subjective approach, the firm's weighted average cost of capital serves as a baseline. And so the firms know for a project that's just as risky as what we already do, for a project that's just as risky as our firm's assets, the appropriate cost of capital would be the weighted average cost of capital, and we can compute that, and that's our baseline. Firms also and managers also understand their business, so they look at a project and they can say, oh, well, that's riskier or that's safer, and then they can make adjustments to that. So, for example, suppose they evaluate a project and they determine that it's a little bit riskier than the average project at the firm. So it's a little riskier than what we're already doing. Therefore, weighted average cost of capital is average, and they may add 1%. They may look at a different project and determine it's a lot safer. So they know the weighted average cost of capital would be less than what they would use for average, which is weighted average cost of capital. Maybe in this case, for a lot safer, they subtract 3 points. And if they're looking at a project, even if it's a completely unrelated line of business than what they're already doing, but it's just as risky as what they're currently doing, then the weighted average cost of capital would be appropriate. But notice the cost of capital for the project depends on the risk of the project, and managers are making adjustments. Often managers will actually, have buckets, and they'll, here might be average, so there's no adjustment. Here they might have a little above average risk, a lot above. Oops, it should be -1 and -3. And they'll put the project into the bucket and make the appropriate adjustment. So let's take a look at an example. M&A, they have a weighted average cost of capital of 12%. There's a project that would cost $9 million today, and it's expected to produce cash flows of $1 million forever. First million in a year, so in 1 year $1 million, 2 years $1 million, 3 years $1 million, forever and ever and ever. Project is equally as risky as the firm's average project. Well, we know if the project's just as risky as what the firm's currently doing, that this 12% weighted average cost of capital is the appropriate rate to use to discount the cash flows for this project. In this case, we have a situation where we put in 9 million. We expect 1 million forever and ever, and the present value of that's just 1 million over the appropriate discount rate, which in this case, as we talked about, is the weighted average cost of capital of 12, not because M&A has 12, but because this project's just as risky as what M&A is currently doing, and what M&A is currently doing is reflected in the weighted average cost of capital of 12%. So this is a project where you put in 9 million today, you expect 1 million a year forever and ever and ever, discounted by 12%. The NPV is actually negative, so they should not pursue the project. Here's a project that M&A is looking to do. Costs 9 million today, 1 million forever, with the first million expected in a year. But the project is less risky than the firm's average risk project, such that the appropriate discount rate for this project is 2 percentage points different than the one that they would use for an average risk project. So we know it's 2% different. We know it's less risky. So therefore, we know that the appropriate cost of capital for this project is equal to 12 minus 2%, which is 10%. So again, we've kind of established already that the 9 million that gets paid out today, 1 million forever. We've already talked about why the appropriate cost of capital is 10%. 12% is what we would use for average risk. This is less than average risk, so it should be a lower cost of capital. How much? 2 percentage points, therefore 10%. Put in 9 million, get 1 million forever, which has a present value of 10 million. This project has an NPV of 1 million, so they should undertake the project. So the two examples were both put in 9 and then get 1 forever and ever. when we had an average risk project, the benefits of the million weren't enough to offset the 9 that you had to pay at time zero. But with a little bit safer project, discounting by a lower rate, you wind up with an NPV that's positive, highlighting the importance of the cost of capital, but also you got to make sure you get the appropriate one. The reason we could use 10 here instead of 12 was because we had a project that was less risky than the firm's average risk project. If it was average, we use 12. Here it's less, so we use 10. Method number 2 is called the Pureplay approach. And here, remember, the cost of capital for a project reflects the risk of that project. And the risk reflects the risk of the assets, which is tied to the line of business. So if we get the weighted average cost of capital of firms that are engaged in the same line of business as a potential project, those weighted average costs of capitals reflect those firms' assets which are in that line of business, which is the same one as the project that we're looking at. And so it's very useful to say, okay, these firms engage in this line of business. Their weighted average costs of capital tell us something about the level of risk. So let's use that. And you could use the weighted average cost of capital of a single firm, which is what we're going to do in this class. You could take some kind of industry average. You could do something with those numbers to say this reflects the risk associated with that line of business. So here's an example. You got Hooters, the restaurant business, and they decided for whatever reason to enter the airline business in 2002. The appropriate cost of capital for them to use would have been much wiser to use something like the average weighted average cost of capital of other airlines, because that would have reflected airline assets, than it would have been for them to use the weighted average cost of capital of their firm, because their firm would reflect the risk of restaurants, and they were looking to get into the airline business. So if they looked at other airlines, those WACCs would reflect that airline business. Let's take a look at an example. M&A, their line of business is to sell coffee. They have a weighted average cost of capital of 12%. There's a project that would cost $9 million today, $1 million forever, first million in a year. And the project involves selling juice, and there's a note that Jefferson Juices, which sells juice, has a weighted average cost of capital of 10%. Well, we know the expected cash flows in this case. We know we're going to put in 9 and then get 1 million forever and ever and ever. So the present value of that is 1 million over the appropriate cost of capital. In this case, it looks like we've got two numbers that might be relevant. We've got M&A, the company doing the project, which has a weighted average cost of capital of 12, and Jefferson Juices, which has a weighted average cost of capital of 10%. But the 12% reflects selling coffee. The 10% reflects selling juice, and that's what this project is. So 10% makes sense to use as the cost of capital because it reflects the risk associated with the same line of business as the project. And if the cost of capital is 10%, then the NPV is $1 million, and the company should pursue, should undertake, should accept this project. Important, look at the line of business of the project, identify the weighted average cost of capital of a company in that line of business, and that is a good an approach one could take to get a reasonable and defensible cost of capital for a particular project.